of Life podcast, where psychology comes to life and the sciences, athletics, the arts, culture, and spirituality. Here today to talk about the inner critic and lead an IFS, internal family systems guided meditation that can help you separate from an inner critic voice. And we'll talk about what that means in a little bit. A little bit about myself. I'm a social worker. I've been a healer my entire life and had 20 years in private practice where I work now. And that's where I've learned IFS, internal family systems therapy. And today I wanted to talk about why it's ineffective to fight with or dispute some of these parts of us that we have, like an inner critic, that are actually trying to protect us. And one of the symptoms of having an inner critic, you might know this and be familiar with it, is procrastination. And a lot of people struggle with that. Sometimes it's not always obvious that we have an inner critic, but today you might be surprised to find that they're pretty common. And they're relatively, it can be not easy to deal with unless we know where to focus. And that's the reason that I'm bringing these meditations every Friday at noon to teach this style of focusing, a meditative type of awareness, a non-judgmental awareness that IFS has taught me and given me so much insight into my own life and my work with clients. Well, so the format for today is going to be really 10 minutes or so of me teaching about the inner critic, what it really is, what it looks like, and how to deal with it, how to work with it using the IFS model. And then we're going to just practice that. I'm going to do a short guided meditation. I want to remind people that you can interact with me on Facebook here. Obviously, I won't be watching that while I'm teaching and leading the meditation, but after that, there'll be a 5-minute period where I will respond to questions. And I welcome those questions that you may have. You can also watch this anonymously on YouTube if you're not comfortable with others seeing who's watching. And by the way, this, that's not recorded. That's the people who are participating are not recorded in the live stream when it's relayed later. If you've ever felt like something was inherently wrong with you, this is for you. And not everyone is willing to admit that, but today's a place where we can be reflective. Have you ever felt totally awful about yourself? Maybe you've struggled with procrastination, or it can show up as lacking confidence socially, maybe in your family. And when we explore inside ourselves during these moments, we often discover what we can call an inner critic. And this is a part of us that's responsible for our feeling worthless. It criticizes us. It makes us feel ashamed. Maybe it makes us feel hopeless, inadequate, and just plain awful about ourselves because we're having one of these critic attacks. I think Brown talks about having a shame attack. And that's another way to look at this. The inner critic can trigger a part of us that feels ashamed. But if we look closely and slow down the mental activity of what's going on, there's usually a active part of us, an energized part. In other words, in the nervous system, there's two branches: the energized part, the action part of the nervous system, and then the relaxation part. So the energized part of this cycle, this dynamic that can be very depressing actually, is this inner critic. It responds kind of fight or flight, as if something's wrong, and it directs that energy and attention. Something's wrong with us. You've done something wrong, and it tells you perhaps what you've done wrong. Maybe it has names for you. It calls you stupid. It says you're an idiot. A lot of times we know where that voice or tape, so to speak, comes from. Maybe you've done therapy, or you just understand that, it maybe came from somebody in your life that treated you that way and actually criticized you. And so that's one way we can develop an inner critic, because if we're criticizing ourselves, it's slightly more, or maybe a lot more better than being surprised and naive to somebody laying into us and telling us that we're not valuable to them. So we do it to ourselves. We take it on ourselves. But I want to point out that all the insight in the world about where this inner critic voice of yours comes from doesn't actually help in the moment. And there's a lot of therapies that teach how to overcome it, override the voice, fight with it. invalidate it, dispute it. That's sort of the basis of cognitive behavioral therapy. And that's well-intended and it can work up to a point. But because, in my experience, the nervous system is activated by the inner critic, it's really important to also, when we're talking about healing work from the inner critic, it's important to get into the same state that our nervous system actually gets into and work with it from that level. Because in the moment when something happens, it's our fight or flight response. It's our very primitive brain that responds. And we have to sort of open that up in therapy to begin to change it. The brain is so plastic. It's this idea of neuroplasticity. And we can learn new things, but there's this idea of what wires together fires together. So what fires together wires together. I had that wrong. What fires together wires together. We have to have a similar experience to the thing that we want to change. It has to fire. That experience has to fire in our brain in order for us to have a new experience with it. Otherwise, the habit is going to be there. And we can believe the words of the inner critic. And it can lead to all sorts of symptoms like performance anxiety, self-doubt, low self-esteem, guilt, obsessive thinking, and addictions. And without realizing it, some of these heavy-duty symptoms like depression or addictions can be traced back to the activity of this inner voice, this what we call the inner critic. So what I want to talk about today is how to approach the inner critic and develop a relationship with that part of you. That's what IFS teaches me. That's my customary cough every time I do this. IFS teaches us that we can actually get to know our parts, the parts of our psyche that, first of all, there are parts, and we have a lot of activity going on when we look closely and reflect on it. And it's not unitary by any means. That's sort of a mythology that more and more we're letting go of in psychology, that the mind is unitary, or that somehow the goal is to have a unitary mind. In IFS, the goal of therapy is to embrace this natural multiplicity, these so-called parts that we have. And by embracing them and getting to know them, just like a good leader, a good CEO, or a good orchestra conductor, perhaps, or a good parent, we can respect each of those parts' individuality. They're very distinct. And they don't all have to blend together and be homogenous. They can remain distinct and serve very distinct roles in our psyche. And often they are protective roles, in fact. That's how parts emerge. That's how we develop these parts, is through an experience that something happened to us that might have been painful or disappointing. It doesn't have to be traumatic, but especially traumatic things create these parts, or we can say sort of splits. That's sort of an old term that would be used in DID therapy. And it used to be thought of as pejorative. It used to be, sort of like negatively thought of. That person's splitting. They have this other persona that's coming out, and that's a problem. And if in IFS we don't see it as a problem at all, we just see it as interesting and something to get to know and learn from, as opposed to trying to fight and challenge all the time. These things are happening for a reason. So it's a very mindful kind of awareness. Why don't we try going with it, notice what it's doing for us, get to know it. Maybe we can try to help it do what it's doing. Maybe we can understand what it's afraid of. What it's afraid would happen if it wasn't doing this job of criticizing us all the time. And then that reveals usually another part of us, what we call in IFS the exile, the part that may be unprotected and maybe feels ashamed, maybe feels isolated or abandoned. Those are difficult feelings. Most of us don't wake up in the morning and hope that we experience those feelings, those exile feelings. That's why they get exiled. And that term exile is kind of a stand-in you can think of as the old term of subconscious in psychology. And so much of our life is subconscious. It's not in our direct awareness right now. It's exiled. So what we do in IFS is we practice getting to know the protectors, honoring them, respecting them, getting to know their story, and then ultimately, when we have a relationship with these protective parts, like an inner critic, we can simply ask it, would it be willing to step back and step aside and let us have access, exposure to what it's protecting? And at first they don't always do that, or we don't want that to happen. But as we learn and get familiar with the pacing of what this practice is, it's a mindful awareness. So we don't have to react to anything. So if you're practiced at meditation or mindfulness, this will come naturally to you. We're simply there to get to know what's coming up, to observe it, and maintain a non-judgmental awareness of it. So today, that's what I'm going to help you practice doing. Hopefully that's what you're here. Maybe you're here for. Maybe you've heard about internal family systems, or maybe you just want to get unstuck with an inner critic voice, or procrastination, low self-esteem, that sort of thing. One thing I want to mention before we just jump right into the exercise and meditation is the qualities of self, what we call an IFS self. Other modalities call these different things. You can think of it as a spiritual state. It's a meta-awareness. If you're trained in pure psychology, neurobiology, it's, I suppose we would call it executive function. It's a kind of flow state. In psychology, flow is a term that's well known. It's kind of the experience of it is kind of delicious. It's kind of like what Daniel Siegel calls the hub, the center, and what Dick Schwartz calls the eye of the storm. The center of all of our parts, our meta awareness, it's sort of an ability for us to go in any direction. It's kind of fluid, and it has these qualities. It has the sense of calmness. It's very peaceful. We can feel courageous, inspired in that place. We can feel compassionate in that place of self, and connected. These are all C words, by the way. If you haven't noticed, we can feel clear. It's like the eye of the storm. It's in the middle. Curious, creative, and confident. And when we develop trust with our parts, when we can unburden them from pain that they're carrying, well, those parts will open up more of that centered space for us. Because the center is, if you've ever listened to teaching of like Dr. Brene Brown, or anyone in the trauma field really that's taught about this, being in that centered place, that sort of sweet, wonderful, peaceful place, is in fact very vulnerable. It can be vulnerable. It also is a very creative place. So those two things go together. And when we are injured emotionally or physically, we protect and we constrain and we restrict. Our thinking gets more rigid. Our body gets more rigid. And that center space gets very small. It gets very difficult to stay in the center. The window of tolerance is another term for that center space. So we're going to try to do some work opening that space today. I hope you're ready for that. And so I'm going to invite you now to turn your attention inside. And that can simply mean closing your eyes if it feels right to do that. It can mean using a soft focus, focusing on a single point in the room in front of you, and letting your eyes sort of soften, blur. There's no agenda with what you're doing in the next few moments. I'm going to guide us through first just getting in touch with what's happening in the room around you. I think it's always helpful to work from the outside in and create sort of safety and trust with your parts. So just perhaps noticing your sense of sight. If your eyes are closed, you still have that awareness, and maybe the sense of light coming in behind your eyelids. And just notice that without trying to change it. And if it feels right to you, you might take a few slower and deeper breaths. Just allowing your breath to slow on the inhale to the count of 3 or 5. And letting go on the exhale to the count of 6 or 8. Opening your awareness, noticing what's here for you today as you're sitting. Being aware of your posture, the way your body feels. Many times during the day, we're pushing away some of these thoughts and feelings in order to get something done and go somewhere and do something. So for the next few moments, just take in the message that you are right where you need to be. and everything's happening that needs to be happening. So even if there's a discomfort in your body or pain, that now that you slow down your mind, you can feel that discomfort. That's okay. Just give that your full attention. Your body is supposed to do that. Pay full attention to whatever is emerging for you. And if multiple things are emerging, as is very common, if we're new to meditation or if we've just had a busy day, that's okay too. You may begin to notice the qualities of these different experiences you're having. One part of you may be thinking about what you were going to be doing during this time, having trouble maybe arriving here. That's okay. Give that your full attention for a moment. Let it know it's welcome. Other parts you may have, a distracted part, give that your full attention. Skeptical parts, doubtful parts, that's okay. Just welcome those parts. And as you do this, you're perhaps noticing there's a you, and then there is the activity of your mind or body. And your awareness is separate from the activity, the experience of it. It can be blended, it can be unblended. So just notice if you're blended with any parts. And we can tell that's the case if you notice there's some agenda in your mental activity. There'll be a feeling that's taking priority. It's like occupying the visual space for you. And I'm going to ask you to invite any of those parts that have agendas to relax and step aside, and to give you some space here to work on this very specific protective part of you, the inner critic. So asking distractions to step aside and wait, asking other things that were getting your attention, just ask them to wait. And bring your attention now to perhaps a moment where you have experienced this inner critic voice. Maybe it's not hard to imagine. I'll ask you to use your social ability to imagine that this critic is like another person. And how close to it can you be right now? Is it in the room with you right now? Or perhaps not. Perhaps it's very distant. Just see how close you can get to it. And if you can't get very close to it, that's okay. That's pretty normal. Just notice how you feel towards this critic voice. Is there an anxiety? Is there a fear? Is there hatred? Oftentimes we, over time, hate this part of us because we think it's responsible for bringing us down. So notice how you feel towards the critic. And right away, you may begin to realize you've got more than one part. That's normal. You've got the inner critic, and then you've got a reaction to it. Perhaps you feel ashamed when you're in the room with the critic. Perhaps you feel small. That's another part of you. And we're going to just work with one part at a time. So if you do feel that exile part, like small or ashamed or worthless, let it know you get that it's there, but that we're not going to talk to it directly yet. We're going to first deal with the inner critic. And that can be a little counterintuitive. A lot of therapies go right to the exiles, go right to the pain, and we're not going to do that. We're going to talk to the inner critic that's protecting us from the pain and maybe causing some of it. See if you can just soften your awareness towards this inner critic. Let's send a message to it that you're open to the idea that maybe it's there to help you in some way. And it even may be saying horrible things about you. It may not appear to be there to help you at all. And just see if you're open to borrowing my compassion. If it's not easy for you to have it for this part, that's okay. You can borrow mine. I'm interested in it. Often these parts are not what they appear to be, so I have that confidence from experience. And if you don't have that confidence, that's okay. Just as much as you can, follow my lead and extend this interest towards the inner critic. Maybe you can ask it, what does it think it's trying to help you with? And let the answer just come to you. Don't try to think too hard about it. What is it trying to help you with? What does it think it's trying to help you from? Or what is it afraid would happen if it didn't do this job of criticizing you and maybe putting you down? What is it afraid would happen? And you're there to listen to it. If you're in the healing profession, you've been trained, you know how to listen. Some of those parts can be helpful here. You're just going to listen. There's no need to respond or solve this problem. Just listen to the story. Why does it think it needs to do this? And there may be a very specific time or place in your life that this inner critic started and got its orders, got its marching orders, where it felt like it had to step in and criticize you. So you might be getting a sense of the age of this part of the inner critic. It may, at first, you perhaps might have thought it was kind of sophisticated and powerful, but actually when we ask these questions, we sometimes realize they're quite young, these protectors. They're swinging way above their weight class. And they're trying to do a job that maybe they can't do very well. So just, if you can feel that softness, some compassion towards this part for being there. It's a little more complicated than it often lets on. And notice how it changes. Perhaps the inner critic, if you have an image of it, that's helpful to use the visual cortex to see this part. Or maybe it's just a voice. How is it changing as you interact with it? And if it's not changing, if it's just kind of piling up, sometimes this is what happens. We give full attention to it and it just takes advantage of that space and doubles down on the criticism and starts criticizing what we're doing right now. And so you might just ask it a little more directly. Why is it pushing so hard on you? Why does it not trust that it can take a break for a minute and let up on you? And a lot of times what we get from these parts is they tell us about another part of our system that they're polarized with, like a procrastinator or a really small and helpless child. And the protector may say something like, well, if I let up on you, you're not going to know what the heck you're doing. You're going to be clueless. And so, we can validate that up to a point. We can let it know we get it. But it's important to also say to that critic, to ask it if it wants help with helping you to not feel so small and powerless or worthless. And it may say to you, yeah, I want help, but I don't think you can help me. And that's not what we're asking it. We're just asking it if it wants relief. Does this inner critic want some relief from having to be on guard, having to be on your case all the time? Would it like a new job? And just feel the answer in your body. Don't try to think too hard here. If the answer is yes, if your body's saying yes, if you feel a release and a softening, just thank that protector. Let it know that you get it and that it's safe to relax. And perhaps you may have access now at this point to other feelings that may be quite different from this inner critic voice. And just see if you can make space for those feelings as well. They may be stronger, powerful emotions. And if it's okay for you to feel them, then let them come forward. If you have the time and the space and the compassion, just let that movement happen. Our body's meant to move in a very primitive way, in ways that we don't always understand what's happening. That's very important for our health, to have those kind of vulnerable feelings, not be buttoned up and together and always know what's going on. And if it feels like those emotions are too powerful or overwhelming, just ask them to slow down. And, just like a good teacher or a good conductor would do, we're going to let them know that you have time to get to all of them. Maybe not today. But each of those emotions has an experience and a story, and they deserve your attention. So if you're able to do this, let those other parts of you, those maybe more vulnerable parts, let them know that you'll pay attention to them when you have time later. Journaling might be a good way to put them down and have some containment of those feelings. Sharing them with a friend or a therapist is another way. Ground yourself in some of those feelings if they're strong. And just appreciating, as we kind of bring our time to a close here, appreciating anything that's come forward during this time. And I always like to invite you to welcome and thank even random things that may appear nonsense. If you went on a very different path during this part of the meditation and lost track of where I was guiding you, that's okay. So that's welcome. The goal here is to really just be with what's coming up for us. And that's sometimes a new experience for us. And a lot of times we think we have to figure out what to do with ourselves. So thanking all the parts that surfaced today. And coming back to the room, I'm going to just invite you to notice again where you are, paying attention to the sights and sounds around you. Opening your eyes if you haven't done that already, and taking another couple of breaths. Letting your breath breathe you, aware of how this body of yours is taking care of you in countless ways every second. With gratitude, the next breath in, breathing in everything that you need, trusting this earth to provide for you, for us. Breathing out, letting go everything that you don't need. Again, trusting the earth to take things that have lost its value to you and to use it, to recycle it. Everything's in balance. And you are right where you need to be. Thank you for your attention today. I'm going to invite you to share any questions that you may have on Facebook. Post them directly there. I won't name your name if you have a question that you're interested in. Thank you. Yeah, I see the appreciation. Someone saying appreciation for a time and place that IFS interested people can convene and share our investment in this work. Welcome if you're a practitioner of IFS already. If you're a newbie and you don't know anything about IFS, you're just dipping your toe in the water. Thank you for being here and trusting this time. I'm always grateful for feedback. This is an interesting and new experience for me, not having any feedback and teaching just to a camera is very different. So all the feedback that you're willing to share with me, I'm open to it. Anything that feels helpful. Of course, I'd love to hear what's helpful and what you appreciate. Anything that you'd like to hear more of that would be more helpful, perhaps. I'm open to that too. Thank you for joining me today. Subscribe to the Soul of Life Facebook page, or I guess you have to like the Facebook page. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. And that way you'll get notification of the next time I go live. I'm here every Friday at noon. And each podcast that I do a podcast episode each Friday as well. And that gets released on Fridays. Thank you for being here. Take care.